Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. So hear the good news as it comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, the 16th chapter. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went and bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had just risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed, for you are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, just as he said." So they went out and they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Over a long period of time, my mother's family was very good friends with another family that were named the Shillings. And this went on over a period of generations, actually. Back in the 1930s, uh, the two families were living relatively close to one another. And my grandmother found herself a widow with two teenage girls. And one of the Shellings had become a widower, and he had twin boys, Charlie and Ray. And so I don't know how he got the idea, but he proposed to my grandmother. And the story goes, it's a story I can't verify, but boy, does it have a ring of truth to it. The story goes that she told him, "I married once for love. I am not marrying a second time because you need a housekeeper." The friendship was strong enough that that did not end things for everybody or start a big fight. In fact, as I say, the families remained friends over time, down to my own generation. My mother and my aunt remained friends with Charlie and Ray and their families. And every New Year's Eve when I was little, at least almost every New Year's Eve, my parents were over at the Shellings' house, and I got dragged along sometimes. And when that happened, uh, whoever under a certain age was there, Georgette Schelling Jr. was our babysitter for the evening. Ray had moved away, and so his family wasn't usually there, but the rest of us were there. And we saw the Shellings at church every Sunday. So they were just a regular part of the life as I was growing up. I mean, you get the idea, and I really hope that you have ties like that. They're very strong, they're very helpful, and very important in a lot of different ways. But as happens over time, Mr. Schelling died, Charlie Schelling. The funeral was, for those of you who are local enough, the funeral was at Vivian's, and then the burial was up at Valley Forge, and then we all trooped back down to where Georgette Jr. was living with her husband, just off Boot Road in East Goshen. And we did the normal, regular sort of funeral things. We had lunch. And there it was all laid out on the dining room table, the rolls and the cold cuts, the potato salad, the pickles, the cupcakes, all the usual and normal and expected things. So I loaded up my plate and I went in and I sat down on the couch where my parents were sitting at that point, and we began eating, and everyone was talking. And that was when I looked up because Ray, Charlie's brother, had just walked into the room. For a split second, I froze. I mean, I really froze. I could feel my heart. I mean, it. You know the expression, it skipped a beat? It did skip a beat, and when it came back, I could feel the blood pressure just rising. And the onset of something absolutely horrible. I was, it's amazing that I didn't just throw the potato salad everywhere, because I mentioned that Ray and Charlie were twins. They were identical twins. And here we were at a funeral lunch, and I thought, oh no, what? We just buried this guy. What's My mother realized what was going on and very quietly whispered to me, "It's okay, it's Ray." I don't know how she knew what I was thinking, but she did. But that experience was just creepy enough. And I mean creepy. I mean it beyond creepy. I mean, we're talking ghost story kind of stuff. Enough that that second still stands out in my mind. The Gospel of Mark has multiple endings, by the way. I didn't say that at the beginning. It has multiple endings that are present in different ancient versions. The one that we already heard here today said, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them." And that is what happened to me when I thought for sure, for that just one moment, that Charlie Schelling was walking into his daughter's house. There are other versions that diverge slightly, that can be found at the end of the Gospel of Mark in whatever Bible you're looking at, if it's a good one. They'll put them there and they'll say, this appears in the most ancient manuscripts, but this one is there too. But all of them, each and every one, before they diverge in rather minor ways, but they do diverge, but all of them include that one moment where the women, having gone to Jesus' burial place, are told he's not there. And they fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. When I think about that episode at that funeral, I get it. The possibility of the resurrection is, in and of itself, a frightening thought. And to be confronted with its reality would be a frightening moment. And before anybody would be running around shouting, "Hallelujah, he's risen, hallelujah," they were probably running around just screaming. And later afraid to tell anybody why. They'd think they were crazy. But they were scared. And screamed they did. Now, the story of Jesus rising, told without context or without preparation, the account that the women gave eventually could turn into something scary in itself, a zombie story, a tale from the crypt. But if you wanted to soften it, you could turn it into a ghost story with Jesus just poof disappearing and then poof appearing in different places. But as the story is told in all the Gospels, he's a very, very physical presence when he shows up. And shows up, he does. In Luke's telling, Jesus appears to the disciples and says, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified. There it is again. They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you frightened and doubt? Why do doubts arise in your heart? Look at my hands and feet." And he shows them his hands and he shows them his feet, the parts of his body where the nails would have gone into the wood of the cross. And you have to wonder what sort of condition they might have been in after he rose. He said to them, "See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And then he asks them for something to eat. John has a similar tale or two. Similar stories. In one of them, the disciples have already seen Jesus twice. And a third time he appears to them when he's on the beach and they've been out in the boat fishing. And he's built a fire. And when they land, he cooks them breakfast. And they're still, this is the third time that he's appeared to them. And they're still not exactly, shall we say, comfortable with this situation. John says, now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" Because they knew it was the Lord. They knew it was the Lord, which means they knew he was dead and they knew he was back, and it was just really scary. The resurrection is a terrifying moment for the women. It's a terrifying concept even for us. and terrifying precisely because it is not a zombie story. It is not a ghost story. It's not anything you can call it other than an account. It's not a folk tale either, nor a poetic way of expressing the triumph of good over evil. There's just a lot to it that you can't box in, just like you could never box Jesus in so very many ways, to anything. What the Gospels put in front of us is an account of inexplicable events that witnesses not just to themselves, but here's the frightening part, to a reality in which God has overturned the most basic fact we live with. The dead is dead. The people die and they stay dead. The resurrection of Jesus, his rising from the tomb, is the beginning of a new world, a new way of being, a demonstration, let's call it the demonstration, that the triumph of good over evil is real, because the triumph of death over life has ended, and the triumph of life over death has become the basic fact that we now live with. And faith helps us to live with it. Faith is what turns that scary, scary moment into an alleluia moment. We're used to the idea that the world can change in the snap of a finger or the blink of an eye. This week, a ship ran into a bridge in Baltimore Harbor, and it was in a moment that a 2-mile bridge, one that a lot of us have driven over many times, suddenly wasn't there anymore, nor the people who were on it. A doctor walks into an office, a waiting room, a consultation room, and opens up a folder or turns on a computer screen, and a few seconds later, the patient can't even hear what is being said because of the words that it begins with. I'm sorry to have to tell you this. An unknown number shows up on your telephone screen, and you answer. And you don't know what could happen next. We know things happen. We know terrible things happen sometimes very suddenly and without warning. And we don't like it by any means, but we know in the long run how to respond. And more often than not, a genuine response will involve either anger or tears or both. But there is another reality where a grace-filled, hope-filled, faithful reality finds itself with Jesus-filled moments when the unexpected and helpful and joyful impossibility shows itself. Something flips, everything flips. The bad news that you've been waiting for fails to crush you. The regret that you've lived with disappears, it evaporates, just isn't there. The grudges that people have carried around for years and years and years just go away. Disappointment suddenly doesn't matter. And that is when the Alleluias begin. They begin never to end because Christ is risen and our lives are hidden in him. In exile on a prison island, in exile because of his faith, in the middle of the Aegean Sea, one ancient believer had a vision of what God was doing. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away." And the one on the throne, who is seated on the throne, said, "See, I'm making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. Alleluia.